Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Tailings and Mine Waste 2023. If we can maybe close some of those doors at the back. Thank you for being here. I guess yesterday we had a remarkable day that officially kicked off Tailings and Mine Waste 2023. We had an amazing plenary session by Dr. Angela Cooper. Thank you, Angela, for an amazing presentation. Very informative. A trade show reception that was very nice, and not to mention the energetic and interactive student networking dinner. So I just want to thank Robin Gable of WSP and Masaki Miyoshi of Tech Resources for putting together that very nice networking dinner. So I guess everybody's ready for day 2. Today we have a program packed with another 6 technical sessions, a keynote this morning by Dr. Ed McRoberts and moderated by Dr. Michael Davis, and the second of 3 panels this afternoon, moderated by Chris Anderson of Tech Resources. And I just want to thank Mike Davis and Chris Anderson, the technical co-chairs of this conference. They had to put up with 326 abstracts, reviewers, and so on and so forth, together with C3 Alliance, and to make this technical program as amazing as it is. So give them a round of applause, please. I hope you, this evening, actually at lunchtime, we have our guest speaker luncheon with 2 representatives from Vale, who have flown in from Brazil just to be here and to talk to us. So we really appreciate that. This is a sold-out event and promises to be a highlight for today. This evening, we will hold our trade show prize draw, and some of you may also be participating in the off-site social events. The Greta Arcade Social still has a few spots if you're interested. I encourage you to join in, and check also your app, Discover BC. Departure, there's a bus downstairs. There's going to be a gathering at 6:20 p.m. So we can take the bus at 6:30. I hope you have the app. Please use the app to ask questions. Don't be shy. I'm pretty sure Mike and Ed will be happy to answer your questions, and we're going to have a great keynote today. Make sure you visit all the exhibitors in the trade show hall area, Kitsilano Ballroom, to your right as you exit the rooms. But we shouldn't be forgetting that Tailings and Mine Waste 2023, the success that it has so far, would not be able to take this shape and this size without the support of our sponsors. In the program, as well as in all the documents that you have, we had put together a list of sponsors. You have the list of advisors, you have the organizing committee, and the reviewers who put a lot of effort in this conference. Today, I just want to thank the platinum sponsors, SRK Consulting, TPF, Geotech Drilling, Greg Drilling, WSP, and Tech Resources Limited. The gold sponsors, Agro America, AECOM, Klon Krippenberger, Trey Altamira, Putzmeister, Tetra Tech, Atkins Realis, formerly SNC Lavalin, Stantec, Suncor Energy, BGC Engineering, Bar Engineering, Geosyntec Consultants, Freeport McMoran, Knight Peasold, Mindbridge Software, Patterson and Cook, DM Filtration, Goldfields Limited, Thurber Engineering, and Vale SA. Thank you very much to our sponsors and exhibitors. We really appreciate your participation. We would not have such a conference without your support. Thank you so much. We want to take also 2 minutes to have an in memoriam of 3 engineers that are no longer with us in 2023. Isaac Geldes Halty, he was an engineer at Stantec in the geotechnical group. Prior to that, he was a faculty member at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, for about 10 years. He was truly dedicated his life to his friends, his family, and colleagues, striving for excellence in every aspect. Unfortunately, we lost Isaac this year. Dr. Andy Robertson, who passed away at age 79, former founding partner of SRK Consulting, or as we sometimes used to call him, the R in the SRK, and also president and founder of Robertson Geo Consultant, one of the true pioneers of the FMEA and multiple accounts analysis, probably in the early 90s. We are still referring to some of his papers. He was also a recipient of R.M. Hardy Award from the Canadian Geotech Society in 1995. Last but not least, many of you may not know him, but I know a lot of you know Inge Anderson. He passed away this year at age 89. Born in Saskatchewan in 1933 and a U of A graduate. He had a brilliant career with the Alberta government, becoming the head of the dam safety branch. Later on, going into the industry as manager of mine development at Suncor, overseeing some of their massive tailings dam construction. Inge was an EIC fellow inducted in 2008 in recognition of his exceptional contribution to the engineering profession. It is important to note that Inge was the first president of the Canadian Dam Safety Association, CDSA, in 1989, and led the merger with Cancold to form what we have today, the Canadian Dam Association. So under the CDA, we have an amazing tailings dam committee that is working very hard on a lot of guidance and support. So we're gonna miss these 3 individuals. Thank you. At this time, I would like to invite Andy Haynes from WSP, one of our platinum sponsors, to join me on stage for a short introduction. Please welcome Andy.
Thank you, Caius. Delighted to be here. Our diverse and inclusive WSP global mining business is almost 5,000 people now, and our Canadian part of that is almost the size of this room. We're really proud of what we've built there, and yet we're actively aware, intimately aware of the shortage of talent in the industry. You know, it can be depressing at times, right? You know, we just don't have enough people. And I know everybody's feeling the same pain. However, when I look out at this amazing room, you know, phenomenal room, I'm actually really encouraged at the talent and genius that we've got in the industry. And it really warms my heart. You know, I think, you know, while we are capacity constrained, we have the genius to eliminate catastrophic failures from our business. WSP Mining is pleased to be a strong part of this wonderful community that David so accurately described yesterday. I think it's fantastic. It was really great to connect with so many of you yesterday and hope to make more connections in the rest of the conference. I think the amazing attendance at this conference, is a real credit to the industry and how seriously we're taking this topic. But I also know, to echo some points that Caius made, it's a real credit to the organizing committee too, the whole of the committee. I know they've put in a huge amount of work, and I'd just like to reiterate my thanks and ask you to join me in again thanking the whole committee for their huge efforts that brought us here. We're delighted to be a platinum sponsor of this exceptional conference and look forward to today's keynote and the rest of the event. And I think we've got a short 1-minute video, which could we cue, please? Thank you, Caius.
Thank you so much, Andy. We couldn't have such a nice conference without having such amazing sponsors, so thank you very much. I'll pass on to Dr. Mike Davis to introduce and moderate today's session. Mike, please.
Wow, it is a big room. This is great. Good morning. It's a real pleasure of mine to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Ed McRoberts. Ed wanted me to keep this short. You should have done a lot less of your life then. It would have made it easier. You graduated from high school in the Yukon, and then you joined the Army in 1961. The legal drinking age wasn't quite 17, but you could in the Army, Ed, so I don't know if those are related, but then you went to university, went to U of A in 67 and went to Imperial College in 68. And I think it was around 1968, 69, when the topic Ed's going to talk about today sort of ignited a spark in his head. He was mentioning Alan Bishop igniting that spark. He left the military with the rank of captain after a stint as an assistant professor at the Royal Military School and began a PhD in permafrost engineering at the University of Alberta in 1971. He worked with a young but upcoming professor named Nordy Morgenstern. I believe he was Nordy's first PhD student and maybe all-time probably most memorable one, I'm sure. He then joined R.M. Hardy Associates in 1973, where he started to work on permafrost projects until he bored of those in 1977, and they put him on something called tar sands. Well, Ed hasn't changed companies once since 1973, but he has a baseball hat collection of company logos that would fill this room. I know he's enjoyed every HR transformation process throughout the evolution and looks forward to more company changes in the near future. He's been primarily involved in heavy mining, heavy foundations, pipeline, mine closure throughout Western Canada, the North, but also involved in projects in Bolivia, Chile, China, in the US, all for a gentleman I know just loves to fly. Not. Honors include We mentioned Inge Anderson. He's got the Inge Anderson Award of Merit in 2020, the 43rd Leggett Medal, Engineering Institute of Canada, Julian C. Smith Medal, Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering Fellowship, the Engineering Fellowship of Canada. The list goes on. I could speak for a while. So I personally had the pleasure working for Ed for about 15 years, starting in the 90s, wrote some papers with Ed when I'm still not exactly sure what we were writing about at times. And he's unequaled in my career, somebody who can make you really think, including on today's topic, which I'm sure you're thoroughly going to enjoy, Dr. Ed McRoberts.
Thank you, Mike. The commercial breaks are now over. Why am I here, you might ask? Because I have. I guess the first reason is Caius Priscu asked me, could I do something for this conference? And the second reason is, well, since 1967, when I arrived at Imperial College, I've sort of developed a bucket list of things about static liquefaction. And I thought this was a good opportunity to bring them up. So my first slide. Thank you. Thoughts and questions on static liquefaction. I thought it was supposed to show up on the screen down here, guys. Anyways, I should say as a disclaimer, any of the opinions that I'm expressing or thoughts or questions are my own and not necessarily subscribed to any of my colleagues, past, present, or maybe future. The third reason I had for agreeing to this was in the next slide. Next slide. Do I do that? How do I do that?
You have
this thing?
Yeah, the big green button.
The great big green button. Okay, sorry. I'm well known for being able to screwing up everything digital. The Morgenstern recently, in a response to a question by Mr. Adrian Day of the COO of the CIM, stated his major learnings from post-mortems of tailings failures as weak engineering was the most common cause of recent failures, which he subsequently referred to as embedded ignorance. That's a pretty brutal statement. Very brutal statement. I've never heard him be so politically incorrect. And it's true. Also, it was coincidental, but he delivered an insightful address at a Rock Science Lifetime Achievement Award, and he called that From Certainty to Uncertainty in 63 years. My time is more like 56 or something. The design methodology, what he really was focusing on was the design methodology. It has transitioned from from certainty to recognition of uncertainty in data, in models, and human uncertainty, with a focus on performance inputs to the design process. I'm not going to spend very much time talking about human factors, but there was an excellent paper at the Tailings Mine Waste in 2021 by Phillips with a slightly abridged title as Human Factors and Failures, as in not technical. Those are my abridgings, who discussed things like cognitive bias, the expert halo, which we can see in recent times with several different expert reports on the same thing, coming to different conclusions, heuristic traps, and we could also, Ms. Phillips could also probably add Stephen Vick's very interesting paper on the normalization of deviance. That's not maybe the kind of deviance some of you might be thinking about, but nevertheless, it's a very interesting paper. This raises something that I just as soon not have to raise, but heuristic traps. Is the steady state strength hypothesis a heuristic trap? And I'm not going to explain what a heuristic trap is. Please read Phillips's paper. And the subset of that is the steady state strength fabric that we think we get to at high strain really a unique condition? There's an interesting state-of-the-art paper by Fourie and others last year, 2022, which does describe some of the alternate opinions about what steady state is. And it really comes down to the fact that we haven't actually got any proof that I am aware of a steady state fabric in the sense of looking at the actual fabric. And let us not also forget the scientific method. It's founded on testable predictions. Testing encompasses observations of the hypothesis in play, as it were, laboratory data, and even modeling, as well as natural phenomenon. Arguably, the primary focus should be trying to falsify the hypothesis, and if you cannot, confidence in the hypothesis grows. Only doing testing to confirm the hypothesis and then rejecting the validity of tests, I could easily be called cognitive bias. It could perhaps also be called climate science. Moving on to some specifics. This was, when I finally found this work, what we see here on the bottom left hand is the cyclic test on very dense sand, and the red line is the end of the cyclic test. The pore pressures under the cyclic loading were 100%. The people doing the work, Seed and Lee, were really happy with that. They'd got their definition of liquefaction, which was 100% pore pressure. But then when you put a load on the sample, it dilated. The strength increased, and the pore pressures actually went negative. And I wouldn't call that liquefaction. Casagrande took great exception to calling this liquefaction and referred to it as cyclic mobility. Ken Lee, who was the co-author, who unfortunately wrapped himself around a large tree on the Black Diamond Run skiing and killed himself, stated that Berkeley had started tests with an anisotropic consolidation stresses, but couldn't get what they wanted, which is 100% pore pressure, which is what they called liquefaction. So they went forward with isotropic initial stresses. This subsequently led to corrections for what was called shear stress bias. Now, at least in terms of the King's English, bias to me means that you're getting the wrong answer. Well, in our work, if we don't have shear stresses, we don't have a load. End of discussion. But Berkeley went ahead and provided corrections for shear strength, shear stress bias, because they'd actually started off, I think, on the wrong foot. What I've just discussed causes a lot of confusion with some engineers who like to think things through. The work of Jim Sladen in developing the collapse surface approach, it was certainly very instrumental in forwarding my understanding of what was going on. And the basic truth on this steady state, on the collapse surface approach, is that liquefaction, it predicts the triggered post-liquefaction mobilized strength. It doesn't matter how you trigger the liquefaction, and that's shown in the schematic on the bottom right. You can have cyclic loading or any sort of unloading or loading. If it contacts something called the collapse surface, then you inevitably, if you keep having a following load not an in situ stress, but not on flat ground in situ stress, but an actual load that keeps loading, you will get yourself down to the steady state strength. I'd like to just throw in the idea that when it comes to understanding liquefaction, a classification of fabric might benefit our understanding. It seems to me we're dealing with three kinds of fabric. One is microfabric, which is the scale of the grain size, the shape, the packing, etc. And certainly the steady state strength is founded in the hypothesis that the microfabric at steady state does not depend on sample preparation of element tests, that they are, where are the fabric analyses that actually validate that hypothesis? I've been looking for them for many decades, and maybe they're out there, because I can't claim to have read everything, but it seems to me that's something we might want to be thinking about. Macrofabric, on the other hand, is how you interpret your data in terms of the overall structure. And the big difference between tailings dikes and normal dams is that traditional earth-fill construction permits the reasonable extrapolation of a uniform lab element test by quality assurance, quality control to the structure. This is not practical or even possible with most tailings technologies. And herein lies the rub, because you have to seek a different understanding of your basic approach to QA/QC. Mesofabric, meso is, I guess, a Greek word meaning in between. Geologists use it a lot. So there's a fabric in between microfabric and what you want to assess for an overall structure that comes into the layering of the fines, the bedding that's in the field, how that might be affected by the processes, tailings planning, all sorts of issues, including how do you interpret a CPT test in the layered deposit. So I thought this was worthwhile mentioning as a way of, and I certainly think that's the way I'm thinking these days. Well, which of these fabrics are we talking about? Moving on to some specifics. Where will the shoreline be in an upstream tailings dam with time? If there's a tailings pond, this is a highly relevant issue, which, when you look at the literature, is largely ignored. Tailings deposited above water and below water is a different beast, for a variety of reasons, some of which maybe we understand. This is largely a forgotten knowledge issue, and it's covered quite nicely in a paper by Compaction of Hydraulically Placed Fills by Turnbull and Mansour back in 1973. These were a couple of old geezers like me who were reporting on the lessons they learned with hydraulic fill construction to build dams. Back in the day, the cheapest way to move dirt was with dredging. So there was a big impetus to use dredging to build dams. Fort Peck Dam, for example, being a good example, and there are several others. Their lessons were that deposition into water, beach below water, results in loose sand. For beaches above water, the beach above water can also get very loose if the new beach being placed over existing beach is such that there's saturated, an upwards flow coming out of the previous lift, which also leads to loose conditions. So even if you're above water with your beach, if you're building too quick, you also get this effect. And the text on the left is what they've said back then. It's too small to read. And by the way, the conference organizers will provide a copy of this once I correct a few edits, if anyone wants a copy of my presentation. But when I first read this, back when I started working on something called Tar Island Dike, it was pretty much a revelation as to what was going on, and the fact that most of you have never even heard about it, probably, is a good example of embedded ignorance. An example of this is an early cross-section of the Brumadinho failure. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner, the right-hand corner, a starter dam, with me throwing in a couple of shorelines, ponds. I've never seen a starter dam in an upstream construction that didn't have water impounded behind it. Water, holes in a mine are a magnet for water. It's amazing how a hole in a dam or a hole in a mine attracts water. And this is a pretty obvious hole. And when you're starting to beach your tailings, you do have a pond developing. You can't get recycled water started right away anyways. So what you've got is basically a built-in banana skin right at the bottom of most, if not all, upstream dams. You can see here the SPT right at the toe. It shows a nastier layer with the dark blue color. There's the second SPT that doesn't go that deep, and the folks that were, the junior sorcerers that were doing this, didn't actually understand what was going on in the pond, and then they found some more nasty stuff a little bit further on. However, this is the cross-section coming from the report to the Valley lawyers, and I highlighted a cross-section that was there. You can see the starter dike, these teensy-weensy little shell being built. You can see where the shoreline comes down, and you can see where the slimes are. You can see where the beach above water is. You can see where the beach below water is. But there's an area there that had to have beach below water, but is not shown in this cross-section. Leading, now that may be that something that was going on in that dam, that they were pumping all the water out, but I very much doubt it. So this is another good example of the devil's in the detail in some of these things. And this is a good example of ignoring, and I just can't believe the amount of dams I've looked at, and the first thing upstream, and the first thing I want to get is show me where the pond was every year. Oh, why would you want to know that? That's why. Moving on, shear stress densification. I learned this lesson back in circa 1978. This is Tar Island Dike. Everyone's heard about Tar Island. Oh, a lot of you have heard about Tar Island Dike, several papers about it. The red circle is an area where there was beach below water placed. You can see here that the dam had a full cross section. This is part you might call a modified upstream construction. The dam was initially supposed to be 200 feet high. Well, actually, it was supposed to be 40 feet high, but there was very planning considerations that blew that out of the water once they started actually doing things up at Suncor, or Great Canadian Oil Sands, it was called in the day. What happened next was, as they built out over the beach below water, there was several failures, and recently Mike Jeffries and others have done an analysis of one of them. This just shows the part of a compacted cell that failed because it was built over beach below water. And I think if I hit this backwards button, maybe I go backwards, maybe not, I guess not. So the big issue for Tar Island Dike was, well, yeah, there we go. So we got all this beach below water down here, the red circle. There was actually some shear straining going on in the clay foundation, which is another whole story, also involving brittleness, where normally consolidated clay ended up being slick and sided. But that's not the topic for today, but the point was that movements, the question was, are those movements going to trigger liquefaction? And that's what we were thinking about back in '76 or so. So there was a site investigation program done where we went and did SPT tests in 1985. And the reason we did SPT tests is they were available. There was no CPT available. And we got a minimum blow count of 120 in that beach blow water. So how did it get from a blow count of maybe 1 to 4 in shallow beach flow water to 120? Now you could say, well, you haven't normalized it. Well, we did normalize it on the bottom. The first one on the bottom left, the scale is the same in all these 4 plots in the bottom. And I know you can't read them, but you can if you get the PowerPoint later. We had a minimum N160 of about 15 based on Skempton's correlation for normalization extrapolated to the stresses we were at, which are about up to 1.2 to 1.4 MPa for the structure. And we also used Lau and Whitman. Well, we got 25 kPa, 25 N160. Duncan Dam and the work that Howard Plewis and others did there with providing some correction factors for higher stresses, extrapolate a little, we got 30. So what we found was, to cut a long story short, something that was quite loose ended up quite acceptable as you built on top of it because of the shear stresses that were involved. Now you have to be careful with that concept because if you're not doing it carefully and understanding what's going on, you'll trigger liquefaction. What we were doing was building slow enough that the tendency to want to create liquefaction resulted in decrease in void ratio, not excess pore water pressures on shear. We proved that out later, and this is something from a CDA conference in Calgary around about 1900. 1990 maybe. You'll find it if you look in the CDA website. We had material that the blue that was very loose, typical blow counts of N160s of, well, 0 in some cases, maybe up to about 6. And we wanted, the tailings folk decided they needed a lot more storage. How are we going to build higher? Well, we did some work on liquefaction. We did the testing, and we came up with the idea of blasting. It was going to cost a lot of money, and Suncor said to me, or GSOS maybe at the time, no, it was Suncor, what else could we do? And I said, well, we could build slowly and improve the state of stress based on what I thought I knew from Tar Island. And we came back and did some more blow counts. We could have probably used a cone by this time, but we had blow counts before, and I didn't want to switch horses in midstream. And we got the black dots on here, which is a very considerable increase. Used the same idea for another dike, where you can see here the cross section, the fill in the, I guess I don't have a pointer in this thing. Anyways, you can see there that there was down the bottom left corner, there was a fill placed as a test fill. And we loaded up beach blow water sands with incremental loads and showed that the initial condition, which are the red dot and the square up at the top, improved considerably all the way to stresses of about 450 to 500. What was interesting in this was that we were getting a much better signature out of SPTs than CPTs, and we'll talk about why that was later. Just to finish up, Park and Burn and the 2004 Canadian Geotechnical Journal did a nice little paper on predicting shear densification effects. My big concern, not concern, but one of the issues I believe they had was that they were basing their C parameter, which shows up in here, as based on Keynote tests with no lateral strain. And I think you're going to get a different answer if you actually allow a bit of lateral strain in your consolidation. Moving on, we know this kind of thing, the importance of horizontal stresses. This is Holsby's work, where it was shown pretty conclusively that what really controlled the penetration of the cone was the horizontal stress. But if you look at what the mean stress does, even for a traxial condition, which I've added at the bottom, you get a better answer. But nevertheless, it points out the importance of lateral stresses. This can be seen in this. Okay. Oh, but you can't see it down there. That's the problem. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So what you see here is some work by Maine. I think it's mostly on civil engineering jobs, where the high over-consolidation ratio gives you a different relationship than over-consolidated. And so you can say if you're measuring a certain tip resistance, then the relative density is overestimated compared to the, if you use the same interpretation based on OCR1, you will overestimate considerably the in situ void ratio of sand. Now, of course, using relative density isn't particularly helpful. Anyways, I make that point. I'll come back to it later. This is some very interesting work recently by Shuttle and Scott Martens and Mike Jeffries at plotting the, whoopsie daisy, looking at the in situ stress based on Packer tests, not Packer tests, south boring pressure meter, I think. You can see here that they've got K-naughts up to 1, which makes sense because they're probably in compacted cell. They've got data that show K-naughts running around about 0.6, which, and these are all called K-naught. I would call them Ks because in a real dike, there is no such thing as no lateral strain, depending on where you are. So I'd quibble about, I've called it K, not K-naught. Also very interesting is there were some tests here, quite deep, with K-naughts of about 0.33, which were interpreted by the authors as very overboard tests. But I think they may be real because you've got spots in your dike where you've got lateral yielding. You are approaching the in situ, an active state very easily. We know from soil mechanics, which some of you may not have got into, that behind a retaining wall, that you don't need much movement to get to the active state. And so that raises an interesting question. If you're interpreting your CPT results in a field situation where you actually have an active state, something approaching an active state, but you're interpreting it as if it had a K-naught that you normally have in a chamber test or whatever, you're going to underestimate, right? Whereas if you're doing a cone test in the passive toe, where you've got a lot of lateral stresses, passive stresses building up because of the movement of the dike, you're going to be overestimating what you think you've got, which points out that you really should be thinking about where you are in a dike interpreting a cone penetration test, not just willy-nilly using the same interpretation in the whole dike. And maybe there are people that are doing that. The next thing I want to move on to is the liquefied strength ratio from case records. And what I'm showing here, oops, how did I do that? Okay. There's a couple of data points in here that I've had an argument with Mr. Jeffries and Professor Robertson on several occasions about interpreting subaqueous failures. Jeffries and Bean go so far as to refer to Sladen's comment as on back analysis as Sladen's error. The equation that's used by them is identical to the infinite slope equation for subaerial slope. Well, you can't use, all of us that have designed things know that if you've got a slope underwater, you have to use the point unit weight. And Sladen's comment was several of these case records have been interpreted wrong because the total stress was used, not the point unit weight. And if people want to dispute that, they just have to go back to the free body diagram in Lamon-Whitman's book, which shows unequivocally what the role of a point unit weight is. And moreover, you just have to think about Stokes' law. I don't know, maybe any of you remember what Stokes' law is, but it's the way of interpreting the velocity of fall of a particle in water, and you don't use the total unit weight, use the point unit weight. Okay, enough said. So what that does is moves me onto this side, and all the data we've really got for structures that have liquefied, all of Olson and Stark stuff, some of these other cases here, they all fit in a band between about 0.05 and about 0.11, up to some stress, maybe about 60 in QT, CN, or whatever, or QC1, or a blow count of maybe 10 to 12. Now, you might say, well, 0.05 to 0.01 maybe isn't really that significant, but it is if you've got, depending on the kind of structure you've got. I mean, it's the equivalent of using 2.9 degrees in a factor safety calculation or using 6.3 degrees. And we don't really know, at least I don't think we really know what's going on in between. And these regression lines that are put in here, I view them as nonsense. The regression coefficients are so low, you wouldn't use them to make a decision on. It's just your fertile imagination that thinks there might be a line here. And maybe there is, but with the information we've got, I don't think we can say that. So another sort of thought is, I'll get back to this point later. I want to talk briefly about lat-A instability line. Oops, I'm all thumbs. Here we're dealing with your steady state strength is reaching this peak point. That's the collapse surface or the instability line. Sladen's view was that that line went through the steady state strength because you're initiating collapse, and the steady state strength is where you end up. Therefore, the collapse surface should go through the steady state point. Lat-A prefers to draw it in this way. Now, you might say that's a quibble. Sure. My next slide isn't a quibble. What we have up here is a comment made by Jeffries and Bean in Jeffries 1999. The instability line or collapse surface is a drainage condition, not metastable collapse of the soil fabric. It is simply the consequence of the plastic volumetric strain producing excess pore pressures at a faster rate than volumetric hardening. Well, here is a technical note, Canadian Geotechnical Journal, 1944-ish, 1994-ish, on dry sand. That is the sand with no water, just in case there's any confusion about what dry might mean. And what Skopek did was, oops, we should make this thing for people with bigger hands. He started a loading up to some point. He then decreased the mean stress until he got to some point with ... where what he discovered was that the void ratio dramatically dropped at that point. Okay? Well, if that isn't the indication of collapse, I don't know what it is. I don't know why the authors had to be shy and call it breakout resistance. But to me, this clearly disputes this conclusion of, or opinion, sorry. Now, Mike is right, I think, when he says this is an intrinsic property of the sand, because he can predict this kind of thing with North sand. Fair enough, but it's a good vehicle for understanding what's going on in some of these failure mechanisms. I want to move on to understanding uncertainty. And I think there's several sort of approaches we have in design. The first one is, and perhaps the least popular these days, is to try and get the in situ void ratio measured directly, and then go look at your steady state strength line and deduce what the undrained strength is if this material liquefies in different zones. It's not very popular because you can't really get that accurate void ratio. The second method that we've got is to obtain a steady state strength or strength steady state ratio from back analysis of liquefaction case records. And the problem, of course, there, as we're all aware, is trying to reduce significant issues to one data point, as it were, an average state definition as well as an average mobilized strength. And the current favorite these days, called best available practice, is to go from a critical state line on laboratory testing, coupled with information from chamber tests, and then to deduce the psi in situ condition we then use. I must point out that this method is clearly presented by the proponents as being screening studies, not necessarily appropriate for final design. For more complex assessments, then you get to an awful lot of discussion and argument. I guess the skeptic would say we're still left with the geotechnical equivalent of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Anything we try to do to get in situ void ratio impacts the measurement. Moving on to some of the variables that go into uncertainty. This is a very nice summary of the results of a round-robin testing by Reed. I just took the plot out of Fury because it was more available, showing the range of variation or uncertainty on the same soil sample tested by a bunch of different laboratories. And with some arguments and manipulations, and you can get this down to maybe a plus or minus 0.02. The critical issue with these kind of tests is that a 1% error in water content in a sample means about a 0.027 error on the void ratio or on psi, okay? Because psi is just actually, it's just, as I think you're all aware, just a void ratio, the difference in situ void ratio to the critical state, the steady state line, or whatever you want to call it. We did a lot of work back in the Tar Island days with nuclear, and it looked pretty promising. We got void ratio, we got total density repeatable at about 0.03 grams per cc based on 5 soundings in the same borehole using a gamma-gamma source, which is different than a gamma source, which is using passive gamma radiation. What it really amounted to was a much larger device than a Troxler on the end of a rope. The problem is if you get that stuck down a hole, you're in big trouble with the national research. The nuclear regulations, as witness what was happening in Australia when something fell off the back of a truck recently that I read about. This is, it's hard to see here because of the colors, but what we're looking at is there's some, we did some sampling of this material in Tar Island Dike. We cored the material. It was so dense. We couldn't push a Shelby tube in it for love nor money. It was just too dense. We got intact core, what we called intact core, but by the time we got to the surface and got out of the core ballots, it swelled. So we had to correct the in situ density by the inside diameter of the cutting shoe, and then compare that to the nuclear results, which for our purposes was good enough to substantiate the conclusions we're getting with this SPTs. It is one way of looking at it, the problem, measuring the void ratio in situ. There's new work being talked about with the same technology used in, I'm having a senior's moment. In those things they stick you in to look at your skull. Get what it's called, it'll come to me. MRIs, thank you very much. And that may have some promise, but again, the technology that is being used takes the stuff used from core logging for other purposes and applies it, and whether the sensitivity is there for what we need is a different, this potential problem. Okay, moving on, shear bands. This is something that's, to me, very insightful, particularly the work about Des Ruiz, where what he did is he looked at the void ratios and shear bands in dense sand and showed that the average or global void ratio that you have did not represent the void ratio in the shear band, and by a significant amount. And which basically says, if you have a denser sand and you have the overall void ratio, the global void ratio, and you get a strength, at least you know what the strength mobilized is. But what you don't know is the void ratio that you now get to, which is a different issue when you want to then fill out a, this kind of relationship. And here's an example where you've got no shear bands, and I think you get denser, you get shear bands. This is the void ratio, the global void ratio, but the actual void ratio in the shear band may be up here. Now, a lot of this is attributed to grain breakage, and that may be the case for some of the mineral ores that are heavily crushed, and the samples you get, the sand-sized particles that you end up with have a lot of microcracks in them because of the ore processing, and are much more susceptible to crushing under the shear stresses that you impose. But for example, we do find this occasionally in some of the oil sands testing, and those things are natural sands that are gently processed compared to what happens in a metals mine. So that's something else that leads to uncertainty. This is an example of a shear band from some work of Oda and Karma in Kazama, 1998 geotechnique. You can see how thin, how thin the shear band is here. And this is a snipe out of Jeffries and Bean with a much larger diameter. sample showing multi-shear bands. And it raises the question, of course, is how big a shear band is it in the field? And it's pretty difficult to go sample the shear band in a tailings flow slide, or whatever you want to call it. It's not the easiest thing to get out on. So we don't really know how big the shear band is, to my knowledge. Stress paths. This is an example of that's often quoted where different stress paths in the same sand at exactly the same void ratio show different responses between extension, direct simple shear, and triaxial. I don't know why the authors were so shy about not showing what happened next. And there's also some work here by Olson and, Olson and back in 2008, showing the difference in steady state strengths that you can get out of different stress paths. I think this business about different stress paths is very important when you actually start to want to analyze brittle failure and retrogressive behavior in liquefaction failures, because the stress paths, as you're developing a retrogressive failure, are not triaxial compressive. They're more like extension tests. So the difference in stress paths up to peak actually are quite important if you're starting to get more sophisticated in your analysis. At least that's would be my view. I'm just going to skip over this one. There's some interesting stuff. Read again on discussing the whole issue of quasi-steady state. I did, and they come to the conclusion that, well, we're not really sure. The big question is, if you have something that gets to a steady state, will it actually develop higher strength as it shears more? And is this a function of the lab test, or is it reality? And I think the jury's still out. There's an interesting paper, I thought, by Zhang and Garga in Vinod Garga in 1997, who looked at this issue with very rapid failure times. They did constant stress loading, and the times to failure that they observed were up to 6 to 8 seconds. And because I had thought that perhaps this was a change in pore pressure effect, but when you're getting the effect with very short times, then internal drainage because of shear bands in pore pressure dissipation, or from a host material into a shear band that's dilating, there's not going to be an awful lot of that in a very short time frame, I wouldn't have thought. Anyways, that's still an issue for us. This was some testing that Howard Plewis did under my sort of overall direction back in Tar Island. And what we did was we got a couple of our so-called intact cores, and oops, okay, I can just use this one. Up here, we've got the intact core, and here we've got a remolded sample at the same void ratio. And you can see we had a quite different pore pressure response out to the strains. The other 2 points here, we had interpreted this post-peak with a shear band using the normal ASTM procedures. And we sort of knew at the time we shouldn't, but we didn't go looking for a better way to do it. If you take into account, when you have a shear band developing, the area of the shear band that's in contact, that area decreases. So therefore, the predicted shear stress is higher than what you think it is with the usual interpretation with ASTM procedures. The other interesting point in this, that the reconstituted sample which would be test number 6, the total shear strain all the way out was about 22.5 to 30% axial strain, depending on what conversion you want to use for conversion between engineering shear strain and axial strain. The intact sample, when you have a shear band forming, then the shear strain in the shear band now is a function of the inclination of the shear band, the thickness of the shear band, which can be maybe 10 times the grain diameter, according to some of the stuff. And you can actually get shear strains then on the shear band that are up to 300% or more, depending on parameters that we're not measuring very carefully. It's interesting because what you've got is when you have a shear band in denser material, you actually have shear strains out to a very significant amount, a point that seems to be ignored. K.Y. Lowe talked about it in the Canadian Geotechnical Journal back in the 70s, not in the context of liquefaction, however. Discussion on uncertainty. Sorry, my legs. The direct method, this was something from Jim Sladen and I back. We sort of were tongue-in-cheek saying, well, you know, the uncertainty on the steady state line is maybe a void ratio of plus or minus 0.025 at best, which is pretty coincident with Reid's comment about maybe getting down to plus or minus 0.02. And our uncertainty on in situ density is probably a void ratio of plus or minus 0.04. So I don't know how you want to combine those. I just used the square root of the square of the two factors, and that's a net plus or minus 0.05 on void ratio, or a psi of 0.05. Hey, coincidence? Maybe not. But the key point here in dealing with uncertainty is the range and void ratio min-max for a typical sand is 0.4. The range and void ratio from 1 kPa to 1,000 kPa is about 0.2, plus or minus about 0.05. If the uncertainty and void ratio is 0.05, based from the lab element into the field, then that's 25%. Sorry, yeah, 25% of the total range. That's pretty uncertain, isn't it? You really want to get down to a void ratio of uncertainty of 0.01 maybe. You want to get a number that you want to rely on, and you can't. Or at least we haven't got something that does it. And to think that the cone is going to give you better, I have my doubts. Kramer in 1989 put together a very nice discussion of exactly this point. It's in the Geotechnical ESDM Journal, Geotechnical Engineering. And he did a statistical analysis of this issue, expressed over here with a parameter he calls V sub C, which is the coefficient of variation. And he looks at the correction factor that's required to give a certain level of confidence in what you're using based on the slope of the critical state line. And I could spend 15 minutes explaining all of that. I won't. I'll just say, if you're interested, go read Kramer. We now come to the best practice discussion, which is you got a CPT, a chamber test, you got a critical state line, and you get a psi, and you're off to the races. Sladen took objection to some of the original work. This was Ticino's sand. This was the line that, the average line what he pointed out. So what we have here is the normalized CPT, which is the cone tip resistance divided by the mean stress as a function of psi, but the lines depend on the mean stress. I'm not sure exactly how that, you've got the normalization here, but it depends on the normalization here. Now, there was a lot of discussion about this point back in the late 90s, and some of Sladen's comments were somewhat vilified, but it ended up being that Jeffries and Bean finally agreed that he was right, and they came up with a method of handling this that involved 12 parameters. So there's some certainty in all of that, I would suggest. I can't resist putting this in here. This is Vasek's expansion of cavities theory back in 1972, where he says that this parameter, which is the equivalent of the tip resistance, is a function of the mean stress times a factor Q, F sub Q. F sub Q is a function of the index of rigidity, reduced rigidity index, which is a function of the rigidity index for a incompressible material, and then you add in this additional compressibility term. What that's basically saying is that the cone tip resistance is a function of the mean stress, the G, and the compressibility. And why? The argument that Jeffries and Bean made back when they first started doing this was that they had normalized the issue, and therefore that was a good basis for proceeding. But where we've got to now is all these correction factors to actually take into account the reality of compressibility and shear modulus with those 12 parameters that are in Jeffries and Bean's book. And the question is, that was applied to Ticino sand. It could be applied to any of the chamber test results, but it doesn't seem to be. People are using these chamber test results that have this flaw in them, but not even acknowledging this issue from what I read. Anyways, doesn't inspire confidence. Interestingly, someone called Amati and Peter Byrne and Campanella at UBC did a cone tip resistance and sand modeling verification, and they concluded that looking at Ticino sand and their model, that the error band between predicted and measured values was 25%. In the sentence before it, they said the comparisons between predicted were satisfactory. I put the question mark in there, but it was plus or minus 25%. They also noted that the varying the vertical stress while keeping the in situ horizontal stress constant had virtually no effect in cone resistance. And Furry, interestingly enough, quotes someone who quoted Jan Malachowski as saying, horizontal stresses are the black hole of geotechnical engineering. You bet. Another parameter that exists in interpretation is this work recently by Monteforti, Arroyo, and Jens, where they look at the relationship here, and they look at the effect of their model depending on the friction angle developed between the cone and the in situ, the material the cone is penetrating. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise, because if you look at the stuff done in the offshore with caissons that are a couple of meters in diameter with a pointy tip on them that look just like a cone, only it's not the size of a beer can with a pointy end on it, they go into great detail about the effect of the capacity of that offshore driven caisson depending on the friction angle. So what we got now is about 15 factors, including horizontal stress, uncertainty in the critical state line, and layered deposits, i.e. mesofabric, to contend with when we want to use what we're all happily referring to as best available practice. My view is, if it is, I'm looking for something better. Anyways, there's one more parameter, that's gas, included bubbles. Now, unsaturation due to occluded bubbles. Go read Wheeler, Geotechnique. Can't remember the year, a couple of good papers. An occluded bubble is something that is created by biogenic activity. And the oil sands, the bitumen that's in there, is a feeding ground for a lot of flatulent bacteria that produce all these bubbles, okay? And that really affects the compressibility. And it means that you're interpreting something that's, in fact, much less, in reality, it's quite compressible, but you're not taking into account what that means. And this is a couple of examples. This is shear wave, compressive shear wave velocity below the water table, which is here. And you can see that with up to considerable depth, you're getting compressive wave velocities that mean that there's bubbles. And these bubbles are not the same desaturation in a truly unsaturated material that's drying. They don't affect the effective stress, as it were, because of the suction effect. The curve on the left is work that was done by John Sopkowicz and Jerry Hanford at Syncrude with nuclear work, and they got pretty clear results of a desaturation with depth, or in terms of, desaturation. And what's interesting here is this doesn't just apply, in my opinion, to biogenic activity of bacteria feeding on bitumen in the oil sands. If you've got Holocene sands, recent sand deposits, you've got organic material in there. And that organic material, if it's oxygenated, is busily, actively producing bubbles. And I think, and another good example is blast densification, the big mystery of how come I blast densify something and the cone, it settles, the cone resistance is less. Yeah, well, what is an explosion? It's a very rapid creation of gas. And you've got a blast densified deposit that's got all sorts of occluded gas bubbles in it. And your cone interpretations have to take that into account, and generally don't. So, moving on. If psi of minus 0.05 is the dense limit for contractive behavior, what do we use as designers? Interesting, there was two references, one by Bean and one by Jeffries, both in a symposium on physics and mechanics by Yamuro and Laddie, 1980. And they talk about either using a psi of 0.08 or 1 minus 0.1 for design, which is basically saying if you want to rely on a certain good strength, you'd better be up at that kind of psi. The psi of 0.05 is purely something around when you no longer have demonstrated contractive behavior. I was interested in this at Imperial College when I was there. My tutor was a guy called John Hutchinson, and he was busy looking at the percent of Proctor of some of these flow failures and trying to get what the density was compared to standard Proctor. And this is out of that paper that I wrote with Jim Sladen back in 1990, 92. What's interesting is that if you think about this relative to, there is no relationship that I've ever seen between percent Proctor dry density and cone. Peter hasn't tried to do that yet. Maybe he will, but if you're designing something and you didn't know anything about this whole business, you'd say, here is some sand and it's being cycloned, and we'll compact it to 95% standard Proctor dye density, and we'll have a whole bunch of slimes upstream of it, and we'll say this material is a friction angle of 35 degrees, and we've got a good design, assuming you don't have a problem in the foundation. And this was an actual design somewhere out east. The relationship, so the question is then, if you want to get a friction angle of about 35 degrees to be sure, or let's put it this way, the critical void ratio plus a couple of more degrees to account for dilation, just to be sure you're nice and happy, then this equation, Robertson, I think is spot on. You put that in there, you really want to get a cone tip resistance of about 90 to 100 QT/CNS. So how do you go from an upper limit of about 60 to maybe 70 with your case records that have liquefied up to 100? What is that path? Or is there one? I hope this isn't a trigger word for anyone. Or is it a binary choice? Like it's either one thing or the other. You're either got low numbers up until you're happy that it's compacted. Okay? And that's basically how I've been approaching the design up in the oil sands for the last 3 decades or more, is that if it can liquefy, it will. It's going to have a low strength, and you better make sure you've got enough of a compacted cell to restrain that. A couple of really good macrofabric examples here and I better hurry up because I'm almost out of time, damn it. This is out of couple of great things in Bean and Jeffrey's book, showing loose layers versus dense layers. And you can see here in this upper example, like if this was, I think, one of the cores up in the Beaufort tar suet, you can see that you can just imagine almost a continuous loose layer running through it. So if you're shearing this sideways, as it were, you've got a good chance of picking up a pretty loose material. However, if this was in a different context, like the active wedge of tailings dam, and you were shearing down through it, you could see that the macrofabric would end up being some kind of a combination of that. And this is again something from Onosoro, or maybe, sorry, Hicks. Again, out of the Bean and Jeffries, showing the same thing in the Nerlich berm, where you can also see the very loose layers and the denser layers. And you can imagine how you might want to analyze this, picking out the fact that the lowest signatures you've got, whatever you're using, would be determined in an analysis by this macrofabric consideration. I'm not going to. This just shows you how you get all the different, a whole bunch of different fabrics in a Suncor example, a Syncrude example. I'll just skip over that. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. You know, if you've got a starter dike and you're ignoring where the shoreline is. In case someone says you have forgotten about the shoreline. No, I haven't. I've just not got into that complication. You've got an active wedge coming down, and you've got this variation in, say, psi here, or the undrained strength ratio that you get to with that. And this was some data that I pulled out of a paper by Scott Martens at a recent tailings mine waste conference. And so I don't have a problem with using sort of an average number coming through here. But then we've got the potential for a weak layer. And now I wouldn't use the average, I would use a very sensible lower bound of the data from the cone tests. So trying to come up with a design number for the use of however you're getting the steady state strength should consider this macrofabric. I think that's almost me at the end. About brittleness. I'm not going to get into that particularly. I'm just very bemused by the fact that some of us have all discovered brittleness, making a big fuss about brittleness. Well, brittleness, we got to study brittleness. Shit, excuse me. Bishop was talking about brittleness in 1967. Guys, embedded ignorance, you betcha. And some of you are actually displaying that by making a big fuss about it, I think. Anyways, conclusions for the junior sorcerers, because the old geezers have passed it. Don't shy away from being a skeptic. read a lot, think even more, and analyze last and least. I think you could design most of the structures we've got by actually using standard penetration tests and doing what we used to call a Han-Yanbu factor of safety calculation, right? Nowhere near a computer, right? And get, because you've thought about what you're doing, just as good an answer. When it comes to, back to the steady state concept, we needn't be shy about suggesting that maybe we've got a scientific hypothesis that isn't quite right. Just think what's happening right now with the so-called Big Bang theory. I don't know if you're paying attention to that. The Big Bang theory is everything started on this little Big Bang, and all the dome heads, big domes in physics have been going on about that. They launched the JW Space Telescope, and to look out at the boundary of what they were looking for a Big Bang, sorry. And what they found was even more stuff. So the Big Bang theory is dead, and so is dark matter, from what I understand they're saying, right? Based on that observation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to stand here and I'll let you. Okay, move over.
What is this?
I got to use this one.
Oh, okay.
No problem. I'm sure all of you out there that have undrained sands in your dams with your factors of safety to 3 decimal points are far more comfortable now. Ed, we really quickly, you've got so many brilliant questions here. You might want, I'll teach you the app later, and there's some good ones. But just quickly, you mentioned Tar Island Dike being designed for 40 meters, and it ended up higher. That never happens in our industry, but in those rare instances, how do we protect ourselves from ourselves? We have to expand these, and we don't necessarily know where the pond is, so to speak. What's your suggestion to us?
Well, part of the design of a tailings dam involves actually dictating to the planners what they can and cannot do. And we're now, I think that's now much better understood than it was. Tailings dam designs used to be something viewed by the planners as, oh, it's just those geotechnical guys playing safe. And yeah, because it's our neck on the block if it doesn't turn out. Mining planners tend to be optimists. In fact, miners tend to be optimists, otherwise they wouldn't go start a mine.
I think we got time for one really quick one more. How do we avoid the banana skin?
Don't build one.
I want everybody, you understand why this was the most fascinating 15 years of my career. And I'm serious, no, seriously, I think what Ed's saying is think. Don't get in front of the computer and push buttons, think. Use that judgment. We talked a bit about PEC yesterday and the quality of engineering judgment, and you just had 90 minutes of what engineering judgment looks like. And I ask you all to embrace it. With that, please join me in thanking this morning's keynote speaker. And a token on behalf of the conference, Ed.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much. With that, it's coffee time, and we're going to change the room over, so please leave room for the work.
I just want to say that I thank the organizing committee for a chance to empty one part of a bucket.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it'll be the only talk today with flatulating bacteria.